Hey everyone, Tactics here with another Season 2 Dungeon Guide, where this time we'll be going over a key that a lot of people have been dreading, Darkflame Cleft, and hopefully this video helps you dread it a little bit less, because honestly I think it's had a ton of great changes over the course of the PTR cycle, and yes, that includes the minecart event. Of course, this video is only going to cover the most important abilities in the dungeon, so if you want to check out everything, find my Mythic plus spreadsheet video, which I'll link down below, or if you're looking for something like pug-friendly routes or even just full dungeon walkthroughs with commentary, I'll be putting out all that and much more over on my channel, so make sure you are subscribed. Otherwise, let's just dive into the start of the dungeon, where the most common mob by far are the menial laborers, and these guys just have a single passive ability in crude weapons, which causes their melee swings to stack up a bleed on their target. So tanks, you want to be careful here. If you need to kite, use things like knockbacks and stuns to be able to get out of range and let this debuff fall off. Use things like bleed cleanses if you have them, or just use major defensives if you get to high stacks. The big lieutenant mob in this area are the rank overseers. They have a couple important abilities. The first is Wild Wallop, which is a 10-yard AoE around the mob, but this hits not only players but also other mobs as well, significantly knocking them back, so be careful not to knock mobs into other packs here. They also have an AoE hit and overpowering roar, which deals damage to everyone, but it also buffs all other mobs, increasing their haste and damage done. So tanks, be careful of additional damage intake once this goes out. The spam caster in this area are the Royal Wicklighters, so you want to keep kicks on their bolt if possible. They also have Flashpoint, which puts a magic dot on a random target. You can just dispel this and use kicks on the bolt. The Lowly Mole Herd is also in this area, and they also have an important kick in Mole Frenzy. This enrages any nearby pack moles, which we'll get to in a second, but this is quite important to kick, as otherwise the tank's going to be taking a ton of damage. Other than that, these guys will just throw rocks at random players for extra physical damage, so be aware of that. And at low health, they'll enrage and be panicked, so you want to make sure you soothe that if possible. The pack moles themselves, like we just talked about, have just a single ability in Nasty Nibble, which is a tank hit that also stacks up a disease on them that increases their damage taken by 10% per stack. So one, having a disease spell is quite useful against this mob, and two, making sure that you kick that Mole Frenzy that we talked about earlier is good to decrease the tank damage here. At the end of this first hallway, you'll be able to take on old Waxbeard, who actually summoned more of those menial laborers that you fought previously throughout this boss encounter. So tanks want to try and pick up as many of these guys as possible. However, this isn't always something you can do, as the boss will throw out a luring candle flame dot on a random player, which causes all of these laborers to fixate the player with the dot. So you want to be prepared with things like knockbacks, slows, stuns, and that player needs to be ready to kite these mobs so they don't get overwhelmed by those bleed stacks. Another important note on the laborers is that while you can cleave them down under the boss, they will also be instantly killed by several of the boss mechanics, which can allow your group to control them quite easily without needing to commit a lot of damage. For example, minecarts constantly zip across the tracks in this boss room, and they cause a high-speed collision with anyone that they hit, dealing heavy physical damage to players or killing any menial laborers. So you can CC mobs or knock them onto the tracks to cause them to be eliminated. There's also the Reckless Charge ability, which targets a ranged player and then causes the boss to dash towards them after a delay. Again, players here will take physical damage if they're hit, but laborers will be killed outright. At the end of this charge, there's also multiple cave-in circles that spawn, so just make sure you avoid those. I recommend having the targeted player of this charge make sure they make some space from the boss and then move once the boss is in motion to make sure they avoid any extra damage. Like the minecarts here, you can also use your CCs to kind of force the laborers in the path of this charge as well. Other than that, you want to be aware of the underhanded Tractics ability, which causes a cart full of dynamite to spawn on the tracks. You have 20 seconds to destroy this cart, otherwise it'll explode for extremely high fire damage to your group. So you want to make sure that you do have enough damage prepared for when this cart spawns. Tanks, make sure when the cart does spawn, you drag the boss over to it just to maximize cleave. Also for tanks, there is a buster in Rockbuster, which applies a 25% physical damage amp to you for 6 seconds. You want to be aware while you have this debuff of any extra damage from the laborers can get quite scary. From there, you jump down towards the candle area of the dungeon. You're still going to be fighting those Royal Wicklighters spam casters, so be aware of that. There's also some kobold task workers in this area, which just put a circle on the ground that you need to avoid. The most important kick in this area comes from the Blazing Fiend, and these guys have the Explosive Flame Cast, which is an AoE fire hit that also stacks up a fire damage taken increase on your group, which can be quite scary when paired with the Wandering Candle Lieutenant. These guys have an uninterruptible, unavoidable AoE hit in Quenching Blast. If you have too many stacks of Explosive Flame, this gets very scary very quickly. They also will put a puddle on the ground and Surging Flame intermittently, so just make sure you move away from that. That brings us to the Blazikon boss fight, which is an interesting one-phase encounter where you'll be using mechanics to interact with the 8 candles spread around the room to either light them or extinguish them. Tanks, just be aware this boss is stationary, so if you ever leave melee, there'll be some pulsing raid damage, or one of your melee DPS is going to get swung at, so make sure you are in range. Now, to start out, the boss will always use Dousing Breath, which deals a heavy hit of nature damage to the entire group and extinguishes every single candle in the room. This is the largest individual hit of the fight, so you want to make sure you have a defensive running for this. This ability is always followed by Wicklighter Barrage, which targets 3 non-tank players and creates a 6-yard AoE under them every second for 6 seconds, which will fire damage and ignite any candles hit. You want to make sure you spread out here and light as many candles as you possibly can, as when the boss reaches full energy, they'll use Enkindling Inferno, which fires out a cone towards only the extinguished candles, and it'll apply a stacking dot to your group based on the number of candles hit. So if you only ignite 1 or 2 candles with the wick lighter circles, you're going to be taking a ton of damage here, but if you're able to ignite like 6 candles, the damage is going to be significantly less. Following that Enkindling Inferno, every single candle will now be lit, and the boss will use Extinguishing Gust, shooting out a tornado in a line towards 4 non-tank players. These tornadoes deal nature damage to players hit, and they extinguish any candles as well, so just make sure the targeted players do back away from the boss before the tornadoes shoot out, just to give you enough room to sidestep the attack. As you'd expect, you do actually want to aim these tornadoes at candles, as the ability is quickly followed by Incite Flames, which fills any part of the room with an ignited candle in it with fire, meaning if all the candles are lit when this happens, there's nowhere safe for your group to stand. That being said, you don't want to extinguish the maximum amount of candles either, as that an Incite Flames cast is quickly followed by a second Enkindling Inferno cast, meaning the more candles you clear here, the more stacks of dot damage you're going to be taking after those fire puddles disappear. To best handle this, I recommend aiming your gust at only 1 to 2 candles that are right next to each other, which allows you to create a slightly larger safe space for your group to be in, but 1 candle is all you need to hit here in order to make sure your group is safe. And from here, the fight just kind of repeats. So you're just kind of doing this dance of extinguishing candles and lighting candles based on the boss ability cadence. Moving through here, there's only a few new trash mobs. One is a Kobold Flame Tender, and they just have the random target bolt ability, but no flashpoint magic dots, so you just can kick the bolts freely here. And then there's a couple mini bosses you'll fight before the next boss. The first is Torch Snarl. He's got a massive stomp AoE hit and knockback ability, so beware of that, and will also target a random player with 1-hand headlock. After a short duration, he'll charge at this player, and if he reaches them, he'll stun them for 5 seconds. So you want to make sure you are avoiding this ability if you are targeted. The other guy here is Suit Snout, and he's got a tank targeted bolt, which you can interrupt. But the more important kick is definitely the Flaming Tether, which is a random target root and magic dot. So make sure you do kick that. While engaged, he'll also spawn burning candles under random players every so often. These candles will persist for an entire minute, and they deal pretty heavy damage if you stand near them, so you want to make sure you avoid them. Other than that, this boss does have a frontal ability in Ceaseless Flame, which will target the 1-hand headlock target if they get hit. Otherwise, it seems to just be shooting towards the tank. So just make sure if you are the headlock target and you do get hit and this cone goes on to you, you pop a defensive, because it's going to be quite scary for you. After taking these mini bosses on, you'll be able to fight the Candle King himself, which, as you'd expect, revolves around candle-like wax statues, which are created by the Eerie Mold's ability. This causes statues to spawn near every player, and these statues constantly pulse for fire damage, so you want to try and remove as many as you can to mitigate your group's damage intake. Be careful not to directly touch the statue though, as if you get within 2 yards of them, you do get stunned for 5 seconds. In terms of how you remove them, there are 2 different ways. The first is through Darkflame Pickaxe, which is a line attack thrown towards a random player that deals heavy shadow damage and knocks back the first thing it hits. If it hits a wax figure, it deals no damage and instead destroys that figure, so you want to make sure the target here puts a figure between them and the boss, and that no one accidentally intercepts this hit. The other way to clear out wax is via the throw dark flame mechanic. This targets 3 random players and does a 5-yard AoE around them after delay, which also applies a healing absorb to any player's hit. Any figures hit by this AoE are melted, turning them into a puddle for 45 seconds, but removing that pulsing damage. So any figures remaining after Dark Flame Pickaxe happens, you should aim to cleave with these circles. Positioning wise, I recommend trying to play relatively close together here because those wax statues do spawn based on player positions, and you can just rotate around the room as it kind of fills with puddles. Outside of the puddle stuff, there is an important interrupt on the boss and Paranoid Mind, which will fear all players if successful, so just make sure everyone is watching this cast and sends out their interrupt when it happens. After defeating the Candle King, players will need to escort a minecart through the darkness to get back to the start of the dungeon, where the final boss awaits. The minecart will only move if both there is a player nearby and there is heat remaining, which constantly decays over time. To refuel the cart, a player will need to venture out into the darkness and bring back a wax lump, which restores a large amount of heat once you get back into the cart's radius. But note that outside of the safety of the light, you are debuffed with smothering shadows, reducing damage, healing, and vision. While holding on to wax, you are safe from this debuff for 30 seconds or until you deposit it into the cart. And as an extra bonus, Hunter players can actually throw down flares, which also count as a light source against this debuff. I recommend having a designated player run out and grab fuel kind of as needed here, while the rest of your group tags mobs in the path of the cart or near candles and fights them in the light of the cart or with a wax buff. In terms of the mobs that you're actually going to be facing here, there's a lot of these little skittering darkness mobs, and they just drop a puddle on death, so beware of that. The important kick comes from these shuffling horrors. They'll try and run to the cart and channel Drain Light, which deals heavy shadow damage to your group and also reduces the heat of your cart significantly, so make sure every single one of these is interrupted. Corridor creepers are the big lieutenant mob in this area, and they're mostly on the tank. They'll stack up the Shadow Fang Shadow Dot on the tank, which is quite scary on higher stack counts, to be aware of that. And they get even more scary if they are near dead mobs, as they stack up Eater of the Dead on themselves for each nearby corpse. So make sure you drag these guys away from any of those skittering darkness small adds once you kill them. Once you've finished the escort event, players can hop into the minecart and be chased by the darkness as they ride towards the beginning of the dungeon. While this happens, players gain the ability to throw dynamite at the boss, which they can aim to reduce its health by up to 10% before the final encounter, so make sure you don't AFK here. After fighting off a bit more trash that we just mentioned earlier, you'll come upon the last boss, which is similar to the minecart event earlier, has the entire room shrouded in smothering shadows outside of a few fallen wax lump circles, as well as a single candle light that players can interact with to pick up and move, which constantly loses heat over time. Again, just like the minecart here, to refuel your candle, you need to have a player run, pick up a wax lump, and then bring it back to the candle to restore its heat. And again, you are immune to the shadow debuff while you are holding that wax lump. It is very important to make sure that your candle does not run out of heat on this boss fight, because the boss casts Rising Gloom if it does, which leaves a nasty 10-minute debuff on your party, increasing your damage taken and reducing your haste. So you want to make sure that never happens. There are a few abilities that will make this more difficult, further reducing your candle's heat if it ever hits them. First is Shadow Blast, which targets a random player and does a 10-yard AoE around them after 6 seconds. When this happens, targeted player just needs to move away from the candle and explode away from your party. Umbral Slash is the other one. This is a line attack directly at the candle itself, so you need to assign a player here to pick up the candle when this ability goes out and move it out of the line. The boss will also occasionally spawn some adds from the Call Dark Spawn channel. This always spawns 3 adds immediately, but will spawn more if you allow the channel to continue, so make sure you interrupt it quickly so you don't get overwhelmed by adds. These mobs just have the same Drain Light ability that we saw in the minecart event, so you want to make sure you use interrupts and you CC these mobs and just cleave them down on the boss without allowing them to drain the heat from your candle. There's also some unavoidable heat reduction from the Eternal Darkness channel. This deals heavy shadow damage to your entire group over 4 seconds, and each tick also reduces your candle no matter where it is. When this channel starts, you want to make sure one of your non-healer players has some wax, and then they can just refuel your candle partway through this channel just to ensure that it has heat when the ability finishes, allowing you to avoid the Rising Gloom. In terms of positioning, I recommend taking the boss near the center of the room on the tracks, allowing easy access to all 4 of the wax lump spawns so that anyone can quickly dip away and grab a wax lump and refill your candle as needed. But that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully this makes Darkflame Cleft easier for you this season, and if it helped, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more great god content like it, including pug-friendly roots, Keystone Legend walkthroughs with commentary, and of course raid guides for Liberation of Undermine. As always, thank you to all of my Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.